In the summer of 1540, England stood at a crossroads of political intrigue, religious upheaval, and royal ambition. At the center of this maelstrom was Thomas Cromwell, a man who had risen from humble beginnings to become the most powerful minister of King Henry VIII. Cromwell had been the architect of England's break with Rome, the mastermind behind the dissolution of the monasteries, and the enforcer of the king's will against noble houses that resisted his authority. Yet, as often happened in the turbulent court of Henry VIII, the higher one climbed, the further one could fall, and Cromwell's fall was as sudden and devastating as his rise had been astonishing. On the morning of July 28, 1540, Tower Hill became the stage for the final act of Cromwell's life, and eyewitnesses recorded details that would later shock and haunt those who read or heard about them. The execution was not only a brutal spectacle of Tudor justice but also a chilling reminder of the fragile nature of power and favor in Henry's England. The day dawned with an air of tension that seemed to stretch across the city of London. Crowds were already gathering near Tower Hill, where the scaffold had been erected for the grim purpose of dispatching one of the most powerful men England had ever known. For years, Cromwell had been both feared and despised by many. His ruthless efficiency in dismantling monasteries had won him the hatred of Catholics, while his manipulation of parliamentary authority and ruthless dealings with the nobility had earned him no shortage of enemies among the lords and gentry. Yet for common people, his reputation was complex. Some despised him as a tyrant and an upstart who had overreached his station, while others admired him as a self-made man who had risen from obscurity without noble blood. Now, as he prepared to meet his end, people from all walks of life crowded to witness the downfall of the king's former right hand. Accounts suggest that Cromwell was brought to the scaffold dressed in a plain gown, stripped of the trappings of his former office. Unlike the richly adorned figures he once commanded or negotiated with, he stood before the crowd as a condemned man, his body weakened by imprisonment and his spirit weighed down by the enormity of his fate. He had been condemned without a fair trial, accused of treason and heresy, though in truth his greatest crime had been the failure of Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves. Cromwell had arranged the match to secure alliances in Europe, but Henry found the German princess unattractive and unable to win his affections. The king's humiliation festered into fury, and those who had long despised Cromwell seized the opportunity to bring him down. By July 1540, the once mighty minister was in the Tower, his enemies circling like vultures. Eyewitnesses recall that Cromwell made a speech before his death, as was customary for those condemned to die on the scaffold. His words surprised many, for rather than railing against the injustice of his downfall or condemning those who had betrayed him, he chose instead to profess his loyalty to the king and his faith in God. He declared that he died in the Catholic faith, which shocked some who remembered him as the driving force behind England's break from Rome. Some believed he said this out of fear or as an attempt to reconcile himself to the old religion before death, while others thought it a calculated final gesture to leave his enemies without the satisfaction of seeing him defiant. In his speech, he praised Henry, declaring him the most gentle and merciful of princes, words that rang hollow to many in the crowd who knew that it was Henry's wrath that had sent him to this fate. Some whispered that Cromwell spoke so not out of genuine feeling but in the hope of protecting his family and his legacy. Whatever his motives, his final words before the blade revealed a man resigned to death but unwilling to let go of the king's favor, even as he was destroyed by it. The execution itself, however, would become infamous not for the words spoken but for the gruesome spectacle that followed. The axeman chosen for Cromwell's death was either inexperienced or nervous, and instead of a clean stroke to end the minister's life swiftly, the execution turned into a botched and bloody affair. Eyewitnesses recount in horror how the first blow failed to sever Cromwell's head, and the crowd groaned as the condemned man's agony was prolonged. Blow after blow fell, each one brutal but insufficient, and Cromwell's suffering seemed endless. The scaffold was slick with blood, the executioner sweating and fumbling as he hacked at the neck of one of the most powerful men in Europe only months before. Some reports suggest it took several strikes before Cromwell's head was finally separated from his body, an indignity that horrified even those who had hated him. The botched execution was seen by many as divine judgment, a punishment for Cromwell's ruthless career and the suffering he had inflicted on others. To others, it was simply a cruel accident that deprived him of the quick death even the worst traitors were usually afforded. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered at the sight of Cromwell's downfall, satisfied that justice had been served and that the upstart minister who had wielded so much power was now nothing more than a bloodied corpse on a scaffold. Others recoiled in horror, unable to shake the image of the botched execution from their minds. Even hardened observers of Tudor justice, who had seen countless executions before, admitted that Cromwell's death was particularly gruesome and difficult to watch. The spectacle left many unsettled, and the gossip that spread through London in the days that followed was tinged with both satisfaction and dread. If a man like Cromwell, who had once ruled England in the king's name, could fall so suddenly and be dispatched so brutally, what safety was there for anyone at court? After the execution, Cromwell's head was displayed on London Bridge, a grisly warning to others who might overreach their station or cross the king. His body was buried without ceremony in an unmarked grave, a stark contrast to the power and influence he had once wielded. For years, his memory was vilified by those who had despised his reforms, but over time, historians began to recognize the magnitude of his achievements. He had reshaped England's government, empowered Parliament, and laid the foundations for the modern state. Yet for those who had stood on Tower Hill in 1540, the memory of his execution remained vivid. The shocking eyewitness accounts of the botched beheading ensured that his death would be remembered not just as the fall of a great minister but as one of the most gruesome spectacles in Tudor history. The execution of Thomas Cromwell did not take place in isolation but was part of a broader pattern of fear and instability that marked Henry VIII's reign. The king's wives, ministers, and friends often fell victim to his wrath, their fates sealed not by justice but by the whims of royal favor. Cromwell's execution, in fact, took place on the very same day Henry married his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, a young woman whose beauty and charm had captivated him after his disastrous union with Anne of Cleves. The juxtaposition of a wedding and an execution highlighted the contradictions of Henry's court, where joy and terror existed side by side, and where the fate of individuals could shift in a single moment. For Cromwell, who had orchestrated Henry's marriages and political strategies for years, the timing was a final humiliation. As his head fell to the scaffold, the king he had served so loyally was already celebrating a new beginning with a new bride. What makes the eyewitness accounts of Cromwell's execution so powerful is their raw detail and the emotions they convey. They reveal not only the physical horror of a botched beheading but also the psychological impact on those who watched. People described the executioner's nervous fumbling, the sickening sound of repeated blows, and the sight of Cromwell's body trembling under the axe. Some accounts note the silence that fell over the crowd as the horror unfolded, broken only by groans and cries of disbelief. Others describe the uneasy laughter and jeers of those who found satisfaction in Cromwell's humiliation. The diversity of reactions shows how deeply divided England was at the time, with Cromwell seen as both a savior and a villain, a reformer and a tyrant. His death, like his life, was destined to provoke strong feelings and lasting debate. The story of Cromwell's execution has fascinated historians and writers for centuries because it captures the essence of Tudor politics: ruthless ambition, fragile loyalty, and the ever-present threat of sudden downfall. His death was not only the end of a man but also a symbol of the dangers of serving a king whose will was law and whose affections could shift with the wind. Cromwell had built his power by serving Henry's interests, but in the end, the very king he had made stronger was the one who destroyed him. For the people who watched his death on Tower Hill, the lesson was clear. In Henry's England, no one, no matter how powerful, was safe. Even today, the shocking eyewitness accounts of Cromwell's execution remain among the most chilling testimonies of Tudor history. They remind us of the human cost of political ambition and the brutality of a system where justice was often indistinguishable from vengeance. They reveal the frailty of life in a world where a single misstep could turn a trusted minister into a condemned traitor, and where the scaffold was the final stage on which the great dramas of power were played out. For Cromwell, the man who had helped shape England's destiny, that final stage was Tower Hill, and the performance was one of horror, humiliation, and blood. Yet even in death, his story endures, a testament to both the heights of ambition and the depths of human cruelty. Thomas Cromwell's rise remains one of the most remarkable stories of social mobility in Tudor England. Born to a blacksmith and brewer in Putney, his beginnings were far from noble. Yet his sharp intellect, legal training, and diplomatic skills propelled him into the service of Cardinal Wolsey, and after Wolsey's fall, into the confidence of King Henry VIII himself. Cromwell became indispensable, orchestrating the king's annulment from Catherine of Aragon and engineering the English Reformation that severed ties with Rome. His management of the dissolution of the monasteries filled the royal treasury and broke the power of the Catholic Church in England. By the late 1530s, he was elevated to Earl of Essex, controlling Parliament, the Privy Council, and the flow of information to the king. Few men without noble blood had ever wielded such influence. Yet the higher he climbed, the more dangerous his position became, for jealous enemies watched every move. Cromwell's authority bred resentment among both nobles and churchmen. Traditional aristocrats detested him as an upstart who dared lecture men of ancient lineage. Bishops and monks reviled him for closing monasteries and confiscating church wealth. Even fellow reformers feared his pragmatism, for Cromwell often shifted alliances to serve the king's needs rather than theological conviction. At court, powerful figures like the Duke of Norfolk waited patiently for Cromwell to falter. Norfolk and his conservative allies longed for England to reconcile with Rome and despised Cromwell's continental Protestant leanings. Others simply hated him for his ruthlessness. He had arranged executions of nobles and clergy who opposed Henry's reforms, often with little evidence beyond suspicion of treason. He was feared more than loved, admired for his efficiency but loathed for his cold calculation. The court was a nest of vipers, and Cromwell, though masterful, was surrounded by enemies eager to strike once he stumbled. The turning point in Cromwell's fortune came with Henry VIII's fourth marriage, arranged to strengthen ties with the German Protestant states. Cromwell negotiated the match with Anne of Cleves, hoping it would solidify England's diplomatic position against Catholic powers like France and Spain. However, Henry found Anne personally repulsive, famously declaring she was nothing like the flattering portrait he had been shown. The king referred to her cruelly as a Flanders mare, and the marriage was never consummated. Cromwell had staked his influence on the success of this union, but Henry felt humiliated and enraged. His enemies seized the chance to whisper that Cromwell had tricked the king into a loveless match for political gain. Though the marriage was annulled after only 6 months, the damage was irreversible. Cromwell's standing collapsed almost overnight, and Henry's once loyal minister was suddenly vulnerable to the plots of his long-standing rivals at court. Cromwell's arrest in June 1540 stunned even those who despised him, for only weeks earlier Henry had showered him with new titles and honors. The speed of his fall revealed just how quickly royal favor could vanish. He was accused of high treason and heresy, charges that in Tudor England were almost impossible to refute. In reality, the accusations were politically motivated, fueled by his enemies at court. Cromwell was blamed for overstepping his authority, for protecting Protestants, and most fatally, for the failure of the Cleves marriage. He was arrested during a council meeting and dragged to the Tower of London without trial. The swiftness of his downfall shocked onlookers. Here was the man who had engineered the king's will for nearly a decade, suddenly branded a traitor by the very monarch he had served. His enemies rejoiced, but many also feared what his fall said about their own security. Cromwell spent the final weeks of his life confined within the Tower of London, the very fortress where he had once sent others to await execution. Eyewitnesses described him as worn, weakened, and filled with anxiety. Letters he wrote reveal flashes of hope that Henry might still pardon him, though deep down he must have realized the king's decision was final. The once proud minister was stripped of titles and dignity, left to contemplate his sudden reversal of fortune. Prisoners often faced psychological torment in the Tower, surrounded by the looming threat of the scaffold. Cromwell prayed, reflected, and prepared himself for death, though he never gave up entirely on the possibility of mercy. Unlike noble prisoners who sometimes enjoyed comfort, Cromwell's confinement was harsher, reflecting the hatred his enemies felt. By late July, word spread across London that his execution had been scheduled, and anticipation grew for the dramatic fall. On the morning of July 28, 1540, Tower Hill was transformed into a stage of death. A wooden scaffold had been erected, draped in black cloth, and an executioner's block stood ready. Thousands gathered to witness the spectacle, for the downfall of such a powerful figure drew immense curiosity. Men, women, apprentices, and nobles jostled for a view, some eager to gloat, others driven by morbid fascination. Cromwell was led from the tower under heavy guard, his appearance far from the commanding presence he once held. Eyewitnesses described his plain gown, his pale complexion, and his demeanor of weary resignation. The atmosphere was tense, filled with whispers and murmurs about what he might say. In Tudor England, the condemned's final speech was a critical moment, offering a last testament that could sway public perception. Cromwell climbed the scaffold slowly, knowing that every eye in London was fixed upon him. Standing on the scaffold, Cromwell delivered a speech that confounded expectations. Rather than railing against injustice or condemning his enemies, he expressed humility and loyalty. He praised Henry VIII as a gentle and merciful prince, words that many in the crowd found bitterly ironic. Some whispered he spoke so only to protect his family or avoid further wrath from the king. Perhaps he still clung to the hope that such submission might win a last-minute reprieve, though no mercy came. More startling was his claim that he died a Catholic, a statement that shocked many who remembered him as the architect of the English Reformation. Whether it was fear, strategy, or genuine belief, his declaration left the crowd puzzled. His speech was brief, ending with a prayer for forgiveness. In those words, the once powerful minister revealed himself not as the ruthless statesman of legend, but as a man resigned to fate. What should have been a swift end became one of the most gruesome spectacles in Tudor history. The executioner, either nervous or unskilled, failed to deliver a clean blow. The first strike landed poorly, cutting into Cromwell's neck but not severing it. The crowd gasped in horror as Cromwell writhed in agony. More blows followed, each brutal but ineffective, prolonging the suffering. Eyewitnesses later recalled the scaffold drenched in blood, the executioner sweating and trembling as he hacked at his victim. It reportedly took several strokes before Cromwell's head was finally severed from his body. Even in an age accustomed to public executions, this was considered unusually savage. Some interpreted the botched killing as divine retribution for Cromwell's ruthless career, while others saw it as an appalling miscarriage of justice. Whatever the cause, the sight shocked the assembled masses and ensured that his death would be remembered with horror. The people who watched Cromwell's death left accounts that capture both the physical horror and the psychological weight of the event. Some described the silence that fell over the crowd after the first failed stroke, broken by groans of disbelief. Others remembered women fainting and men turning away in disgust at the repeated hacking. A few reported that some onlookers laughed or jeered, taking grim satisfaction in seeing a man they despised humiliated in his final moments. But even among his enemies, there was unease. To watch a human being suffer so agonizingly before death left a mark on those present. For years after, Londoners spoke of the horror on Tower Hill, of the executioner's trembling hands, of Cromwell's body convulsing with each blow. These eyewitness accounts preserved not just the fact of his death but the atmosphere of dread that surrounded it, embedding the scene into collective memory. Cromwell's life and death highlighted deep divisions within English society. For Catholics, his downfall was a moment of satisfaction, for they remembered his destruction of monasteries and his role in severing ties with the Pope. They believed his suffering on the scaffold was divine justice. Many nobles also rejoiced, seeing the upstart commoner who had wielded more power than them finally brought low. Yet not all were pleased. For reformers and common folk who admired his practical reforms, his death felt like a dangerous step backward. He had modernized government, given Parliament a stronger role, and curtailed some aristocratic excesses. For them, his bloody end was both tragic and terrifying, for it showed that no one, no matter how capable, could stand secure under Henry's volatile rule. London was left divided, half in celebration, half in shock, over whether Cromwell's execution was justice served or injustice magnified. Once Cromwell's head was severed, it was displayed on London Bridge, a gruesome tradition meant to deter treason. His bloodied face stared down at passers-by, a chilling reminder of Henry's wrath. His body, meanwhile, was buried in an unmarked grave within the Tower grounds, denied the dignity of a noble resting place. The swiftness of his erasure contrasted sharply with the years of power he had held. His enemies moved quickly to undo his policies, though many of his reforms endured. For the common people, his fate became another cautionary tale of the dangers of ambition in Henry's England. The court buzzed with gossip, but already attention shifted to the king's new marriage, as if Cromwell's fall was just another bloody chapter in the ongoing drama of Tudor politics. Yet the gruesomeness of his death lingered in memory, more shocking than even his political ruin. Cromwell's execution occurred on the same day Henry VIII married Catherine Howard, a cruel juxtaposition that underscored the king's volatile nature. While Cromwell's blood still stained the scaffold at Tower Hill, bells rang across London to celebrate the king's new bride. For Henry, Cromwell's death cleared away the humiliation of the Cleves marriage and allowed him to start afresh. For Cromwell, the timing was a final humiliation, as his downfall was overshadowed by royal celebration. The contrast between execution and wedding also revealed the unsettling duality of Tudor politics: death and joy, fear and festivity, bound together in the life of the court. Many whispered about the symbolism, that Henry discarded not only wives but ministers with the same ruthless ease. Cromwell, who had orchestrated marriages and annulments for the king, was destroyed by the very system he had mastered, replaced by the fleeting joy of a new union. Cromwell's execution symbolized the precariousness of power in Henry VIII's reign. He had been the king's most loyal servant, carrying out reforms that reshaped England, yet he was destroyed by the same authority he had strengthened. His gruesome death reminded everyone at court that no amount of service could guarantee security. To his enemies, the botched beheading symbolized divine punishment, proof that Cromwell's ruthless career had earned God's wrath. To his supporters, it was a tragedy, a sign of the king's ingratitude and the injustice of Tudor politics. The scaffold became not just a place of death but a stage for the drama of power, where loyalty was meaningless once the king's favor vanished. Cromwell's death symbolized both the fragility of man and the terrifying power of the crown, a warning to all who dared to rise too high in the dangerous world of Henry's England. In the years following his execution, Cromwell's reputation was shaped largely by his enemies. He was remembered as a tyrant, a destroyer of monasteries, and a ruthless manipulator. Yet over time, historians began to see him in a more complex light. He had modernized English government, strengthened parliament, and laid foundations for the centralized state. His vision helped secure the English Reformation, ensuring that the break with Rome was irreversible. Even his handling of finances and administration displayed a remarkable foresight rare for his age. Yet his legacy was forever stained by the horror of his death, which overshadowed his achievements for generations. In many ways, Cromwell became a symbol of both the promise and peril of ambition. He had changed England, but at the cost of his own life, and his end revealed the dangers faced by anyone who sought to manage the will of a Tudor monarch. The memory of Cromwell's execution has endured for centuries, fueled by the vivid eyewitness accounts of its brutality. Historians, playwrights, and novelists have returned again and again to the scaffold on Tower Hill, drawn by the shocking spectacle of a botched beheading. His story captures the essence of Tudor politics: ambition, betrayal, and sudden ruin. The horror of his death ensures that he is remembered not just as a statesman, but as a man whose downfall epitomized the dangers of serving Henry VIII. For modern readers, Cromwell's execution symbolizes the brutality of an age where politics and religion could claim lives with terrifying ease. His life reminds us of the heights to which intelligence and determination can lift a man, while his death reminds us of how fragile power is when it rests on the favor of a volatile king. His memory remains as haunting as the scaffold itself.